We're here at the Beyond Knowledge conference with Ralph Ellis, and Ralph has just done his very interesting talk on King Jesus. And Ralph, if you will, give us the short version of who you are and some of your background in regards to your research.
Right, well, I'm a researcher. Obviously, you've been researching this subject for about 20 years now. I came from an industrial background in computing and surveying initially, and I'm also a commercial pilot. So a lot of varied professions and jobs that I've been doing, but behind that scenes all the time, I've always been researching something to do ever since really, I suppose, 14 years old. I've been researching these topics. Indeed, one of the chapters in my first book was actually a little thesis that I wrote when I was 14 at school. And I just wrote it. It sat there for a long time, and when I came to write the book, I thought, well, actually that fits in very well, thank you. And so I included it. So it goes all the way back to that sort of time, when I was 14.
Interesting. And your main focus today on the talk you did was King Jesus, basically.
Yes.
And maybe, if you will, can do a brief overview of your thesis or theory behind this?
Yes, well, it goes back all the way to the first book, Jesus Last of the Pharaohs, where I'm saying that Jesus was actually of the pharaonic line, and we'll probably go into that later. And so he was a pharaoh in exile, and I've been building on that story all the way through the many books. I've written about 6-7 books on this subject now. And it's the thesis is getting stronger and stronger that he was actually of the pharaonic royal line. So King Jesus is the final book in that series, and it's finally identifying where on the pharaonic royal line from Egypt that he actually was descended. So basically it's saying that he was a prince, of course, a king and a prince, as many theologians and lay people know. And he was descended from Queen Cleopatra and from Caesar, Julius Caesar, and from Phraates IV, the king of Persia. So he was a very well-connected prince from all of the major royal lines of the major empires of that era, from Egypt, from Rome, and from Persia. And he was born in exile, just as it sort of says in the New Testament. So he was born in exile in a degree of poverty because they had been exiled. So these were an exiled royal family, and we have their history in the historical record. Josephus Flavius writes about these people. And all we need to do to understand what it says, to understand the New Testament story, is to be able to make the links between the New Testament story and this particular family. And that's what I've been trying to do, and that's what King Jesus does. But it goes on, I suppose, beyond that. So it goes into his hopes, his aspirations, what he wanted to achieve as Prince of Judea. And one of the things he wanted to do, and I'm convinced this is correct, is he wanted to become Emperor of Rome. That was part of the struggle he was involved with. However, he lost that particular battle. Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, and he was exiled. And then we pick up on this subsequent story that he was probably linked with the Arthurian legends from England, of course.
Right, and why don't we begin to talk a little bit about potentially the author of all of this? You have a theory that says that Josephus is Saul or St Paul. Tell us
yes, well, that goes again right back to the first book I wrote, because the whole essence of this research is that we have this book, the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, in which there are a lot of famous characters, very important people, kings, queens, obviously princes of the realm, who are just missing in the archaeological record. We can't find any of them, whether it's back in the Old Testament, whether it's Joseph, Jacob, Abraham, whether it's the united monarchy, King David, King Solomon, Queen of Sheba, all the way up through to the New Testament, Jesus, obviously Saul himself, all missing from the historical record. And I just could not believe that was so. They had to be there somewhere. If these people were so important that people were writing all these books and creating entire religions based on their life story, then they had to be there somewhere in the historical record. So I went looking for Saul or St Paul in the historical record, and it just struck me that he has so many similarities with Josephus Flavius. And for listeners who or viewers who don't know who he is the foremost historian of the 1st century AD. So here's the chap who wrote the whole history of Judea, in fact the whole history of the Jewish people, but most especially the history of the Jewish War. This is the AD 65, AD 70, the Jewish rebellion against the Romans, and he covers that in great detail.
And a lot of the people from the Bible, the personages in the Bible, would you say that they are mainly have been, pharaohs in Egypt? Is that the consensus here?
Yes. So going back to the Old Testament, yes, we have these very famous people, and we have this very famous incident, of course, the Exodus out of Egypt. And again, nobody knows where this happened, when it happened, who these people were. But it was quite obvious to me that we have numerous parallels between this Exodus and the Exodus of the Hyksos people, or the Hyksos, from Egypt. Now, again, for viewers who don't know who the Hyksos are, they were the peoples and the pharaohs of Lower Egypt. So these were real pharaohs of Egypt. But Egypt was divided, so we had a pharaoh in the south and a pharaoh in the north, and the Hyksos were in the north. They had this internal dispute, civil war, with the southern pharaoh. And again, this is from the historical record, so we're going into the ancient text now. We're looking at the Tempest Stella of Ahmose I, and the books that have come out of Egypt, the papyri, like the War of the Hyksos, which is a real Egyptian text, and it details this exodus of these Hyksos people out of Egypt. And at the same time that this happened, we have storms and darkness. We have a civil war with the southern Egyptians. And these people, these Egyptians, who were circumcised, of course, like Egyptians were, who had curly side locks of hair, of course, just like the Jews do today, they were exiled out of Egypt. They left Pyramisi, just as it says in the Old Testament, and 500,000 of them or so a large population, made their way across to Jerusalem. Now, is that not a very familiar story? So this is from the historical record. I'm not quoting here from the Bible. This is from the historical record. This is the exodus of the Hyksos people. And the Hyksos people also may well have been the people who destroyed Jericho. So here we have, in a nutshell, the whole of the Exodus story from the book of Exodus. That's exactly how it is. And the only change you need to understand in order to make this comparison between the two is that the era is slightly different. So most people regard the Exodus as happening in about 1300 odd BC, eras of, say, Ramesses II, maybe 1200 BC. But the Hyksos Exodus happened in actually 1620 BC. And it occurred because of the eruption of Thera, which we will probably go into later. So all we've done is take the history of the Exodus, move it back by about 300 odd years, and everything matches perfectly. And so we have a complete history of the biblical Exodus. And the reason I think that people have been confused with the later era, the 1300 BC era, is that there was a second Exodus out of Egypt. In the Bible, that's become conflated into just one Exodus. Now, in real history, the second Exodus was the Exodus of Akhenaten and his family out of Amarna, and we know that that was somehow linked with the Israelite story. And that was the second Exodus that all of this has become confused with. But this was a much smaller Exodus. This was an Exodus of one royal family and his courtiers. So as Josephus says, it's probably about 80,000 people. It was a small Exodus. And they were again pushed out of Egypt. So they were the two Exoduses, and it's from those Exoduses that we get the Exodus story.
Right. And if we go back a little bit and talk about the origins of the Hyksos, do you know if they were indigenous to Egypt or if they invaded from the start?
Well, we don't know entirely. Now, Egyptologists will say that they came from Syria, from maybe even Sumer, from Babylon. which is effectively what the Bible says, because the Bible says that the Israelites, Abraham, came from the Chaldees, from Sumeria. So it could well be that they were immigrants who had come down into Egypt, a bit like it tells it in the biblical story. But it doesn't have to be like that. The evidence is lacking, and what we do know is the Hyksos were a very highly Egyptianized people. So they don't look like immigrants once they actually got there. They look like indigenous Egyptians. So they followed all of Egyptian theology. They had pharaohs, they had the same architecture, they had the same customs and dress and everything. To all intents and purposes, they look like Egyptians. So whether they were immigrants or not, I'm open to debate on that. I'm quite happy either way.
And tell us a little bit about why I think that they actually were they thrown out, or the Exodus, is that the Hyksos Exodus? Was it because something they did, or did they want to leave? What happened there?
I think they were following the stars, because this is the basis of Egyptian theology. It was all wrapped up in astronomy, as we would call it today, or astrology. They were following the movements of the stars. And part of that movement, the main thing that they were trying to follow was precession. And again, if viewers are not familiar with precession, the signs of the zodiac change. Every 2,000 years, a different sign of the zodiac becomes dominant in the night sky. And they were following this precession because it was a way of counting off the millennia from one millennia to another. So we started with Taurus, we went into Aries, and at the beginning of the 1st century, of course, we went into Pisces. And that is why, of course, Jesus was born as a Lamb of God and became a fisher of men, because he was born under Aries, and then we had a change in the heavens, we had a new constellation. Pisces came to be dominant, and he became a fisher of men. So they were definitely following astrology. Going back into the Old Testament again, back to Abraham, I think that the Hyksos were following this procession. And they had seen this change in the heavens. Now, the change that they saw was between Taurus and Aries. And that is why in Egyptian theology we get this change from bull worship, the Apis bull, into sheep worship. And you might say, well, that they didn't worship sheep, but you can see this change, especially within the biblical text, because the Hyksos were known as the shepherd kings. And likewise in the Old Testament, of course, all of the patriarchs were known as shepherds. Now, this has got nothing to do with agriculture, which, most of the commentators on the Bible say it's all about agriculture. Nothing to do with agriculture. It's all about astrology. So these were the people, the Hyksos people, were the people who had realized that the heavens had changed and now Aries was dominant. So they were the shepherd kings. And this caused a bit of a dispute. Obviously, the southerners in southern Egypt had not realized, or they didn't want to change or something. I don't know why. And I think it was this difference between the Apis bull, the Taurus worshippers south, and the Aries, the shepherd kings in the north, that precipitated this civil war. But on top of this dispute, they had another problem, and that was the eruption of Thera. So 1620s BC, Thera erupts, huge volcanic eruption, massive tidal wave. And it's from this tidal wave, of course, and the ash cloud that came over Egypt that we get all these stories of the biblical miracles before the Exodus. And a classic one that sort of, to me, it proves that this was the event, was Moses. He went to his God, and God said, Moses, you take ashes from the hearth of the fire and scatter them up into the sky, and it will fall as dust across the land of Egypt. And that was one of the plagues, of course, the fall of ash. Well, what's that a description of? It's quite plainly the description of the long-range fallout of the ash cloud from Thera. By the time it got to Egypt, of course, it wasn't massive stones and boulders. It was fine ash dropping out all across Egypt. And that was one of the plagues. And that firmly links this whole Exodus era into the eruption of Thera. And we're getting pretty sure now that we know when the Thera eruption happened, because they've investigated it through dendrochronology. They're looking at tree rings. They've investigated it with looking at the ice cores that they've dug up in Greenland, like the Dai 2 ice core. And they've settled on about 1620s BC as being the most likely date. So from that, we can date the plagues event and the Hyksos exodus out of Egypt to about 1620s BC. And surprisingly enough, that matches quite well, because, of course, if you look in the historical record, the expulsion of the Hyksos happened during the reign of Ahmose I, which they say is roughly around, say, 1550 odd BC. So we're only about 70 years adrift. And there may have been a generation, of course, of a stalemate before the Exodus actually happened. It doesn't have to have happened when Thera erupted. So they have this dispute, we have this festering civil war. And on top of that civil war, we now get this huge great eruption. Ra is covered, so the great sun god is covered by this great blanket of ash. The gods are obviously angry. Why are they angry? Well, it must be you lot down there. And so both parties pointed at each other as being responsible, for killing Ra. And we have a civil war. And that was the basis of the civil war. And it was rather inconclusive. And rather than being a battle and an exodus, it was actually an agreement. So they came to an agreement that one party would be given tribute and leave the country. And they were the Hyksos. And this is why we have this story in the Old Testament about the Israelites before they left were being given all the gold from the Egyptians. Why? They were being given cloth and jewelry and oil, precious oils. This was a part of the tribute that they were given to induce them to leave the country. So it wasn't really a battle as such, and then they left the country.
What I would like to ask if there's any clear connection between the Hyksos, the dynasties, and Jesus that you've been talking about here in your lecture.
Well, in some respects, yes, and there is more to be found, I'm sure. But some of the names, for instance, match. So one of the pharaohs, of course, of the Hyksos was called Jacoba. And of course, we have the famous patriarch who was called Jacob, or Jacob as we know him. We have Mamabra, who to me must be Abraham. So there are links between the names. There are links between the cultures, because the Hyksos, they had the curly side locks of hair, exactly the same as the Egyptians. They were circumcised. They had shaved heads, same sort of dietary prohibitions. There are a lot of similarities between these two cultures. And we see those same similarities in modern Judaism. So I think these two cultures were firmly linked.
You raised an interesting point during your talk today, that, and this was mainly about Judas Iscariot and Zealots, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and what I would like to ask is, do you think that these actually were individuals in that sense, or were they a collective name for armies, or for a group?
No, they were rebel units, so it wasn't an individual. The Zealots were a faction, quite a dominant faction they became in the late AD 60s. And these were the people, and I'm sure that they were allied to what Josephus calls the fourth sect, the Galileans as he calls them. So they were allies of the Galileans. And these were the people who took over Jerusalem. So it was a rebel faction. And so it wasn't a single person. I mean, the Zealots are known to be a rebel faction. We might only be talking hundreds, of course, and not thousands of people. But nevertheless, it was a rebel faction. Same with the Sicarii. And obviously Judas Iscariot was one of the Iscariot. And they were the dagger men, the assassins. They used to sneak up on leaders in Jerusalem and stab them. So Judas Iscariot and Simon Zelotes were rebels. It's quite clear they were rebels, and they were the disciples of Jesus. And because this was a rebel cause, this was a revolution. And we have clear evidence that this was a revolution, because if you make comparisons between what Josephus says about the Civil War and what the New Testament says, it's clear that there are parallels. So what's happened here, of course, is that the New Testament story is traditionally set in the 30s AD. It shouldn't be. It should be set in the 70s AD, because that's when all these events happened. And from the Bible, of course, from the New Testament, we have that story about the disciples meeting on the Mount of Olives, and then they were surprised by the Roman guard, and they were dispersed, and Jesus was captured, and all that sort of business. Well, there happens to be an identical story in the works of Josephus. So this is in the Jewish War, written by Josephus Flavius. And he writes the same story, except, of course, in the AD 70s, well, late AD 60s. And he says that there was a meeting on the Mount of Olives by Jesus of Gamala this time, the chap who I identify with the biblical Jesus. But this time it's not a meeting of one or two disciples, it's a meeting of 30,000 armed rebels on the Mount of Olives. And they're trying to take Jerusalem. This is a rebel group trying to storm the city. But they are surprised by the Roman guard again, just as it says in the New Testament. And they are dispersed by the Roman guard. And we've got an inkling that this was exactly the same event, because when the New Testament talks about it, you tend to think about half a dozen Romans coming up and dispersing the disciples. But that's not what it says. It says a spira came up. And a spira is a cohort, 600 fully armed Roman soldiers. Now, you don't need 600 Roman soldiers to break up 12 disciples. It's quite clear that this was a major military engagement. And the two stories are identical. But all you need to know to understand them is that this was a rebel cause, and that the biblical Jesus was actually Jesus of Gamala.
Right. And as you said, Jesus tried to overthrow Jerusalem, and that was not the only thing he tried to overthrow. He tried to overthrow the entire Roman Empire.
Yes, right? I've come to the conclusion that he was making a bid for the empire. I initially thought in my first books that this was a bid for the kingdom of Judea. Because, he was a Jew, he was acknowledged later as being the king of the Jews. But in replacing this story into the AD 60s, it is obvious that it's linked into the war against the Romans, the Judaic uprising in the AD 60s. And from the Talmud and various other texts, it's clear that he was making a bid for the empire. Because remember, at this time, late AD 60s, Nero was on his last legs. He was going to commit suicide in AD 68. But even before that, he was losing support completely throughout the empire, because he was bonkers, basically. As soon as he committed suicide, the throne of Rome was open to whoever could get it. And 3 emperors came and went in the space of 1 year, bidding for this throne of the empire. So it was open to whoever could muster enough people, enough forces, and enough money to actually gain the throne of Rome. And Jesus was one of those people who was making a bid. Because at this time in the Roman Empire, there was the star prophecy. And the star prophecy was going around the empire, and it said that the next emperor of Rome would be a king from the east. Now, quite clearly, that star prophecy was something to do with Jesus, because he was the king from the east that had a star that came over his birthplace that people flocked to. So he was the star prophecy. He was clearly making a bid, because he was a king, he was a high priest. It's clear from the New Testament, it's clear from the Talmud, it's clear from what historians and theologians say about Jesus, that he was a king. And here was a king who had a claim to the throne of Rome, because we haven't been through that, but I'm sure we'll go through it in a minute. But he was of that royal line. He was of the royal line of Egypt. He was of the royal line of Rome. He was of the royal line of Persia. So he had the royal credentials to make a valid bid for the throne of Rome. And he did. but unfortunately for him, he failed.
Tell us about the line, if you will, then.
The royal line?
Yeah.
Yes, well, as we've been talking about before, he was from Egypt, of course. He was a prince in exile from Egypt. But what I, in my earlier books, hadn't established is where he actually came from. And in this latest book, King Jesus, it's quite obvious, and also in the book before that, which is Cleopatra to Christ, it became quite obvious that he was related to Queen Cleopatra. So the royal line goes basically from Queen Cleopatra, who had a daughter with Julius Caesar in about 44 BC, just before Julius Caesar was killed. Now, this particular daughter became a diplomatic bride given by Augustus Caesar to the king of Persia, who was Phraates IV. And we have this from the historical record. What we don't know is exactly who this woman is, but it's quite clear if you look at the various records that detail her life that she must have been of Egyptian descent. And it's also quite clear from Cicero that Queen Cleopatra was pregnant when she left Egypt just before or just after Caesar was killed. So here we have this daughter of Queen Cleopatra who was given as a diplomatic bride at about the age of 20 or something to King Phraates IV, who was king of Persia. Now from this union, her son was made king of Persia. But Theomusa Urania, which is the name of this particular queen, wanted to hurry things along a bit. I think she was a bit too impatient. But anyway, she ended up killing the king of Persia. So Phraates IV was knocked off. And then she married her son, which is a particularly Egyptian thing to do. And the Persians weren't impressed by this. So it obviously wasn't a Persian custom. It was an Egyptian custom because all of the Ptolemaic pharaohs of Egypt married sisters, whatever it happens to be, daughters sometimes. So here we have this queen in Persia, Theomusa Urania. And the Persians weren't impressed by all these shenanigans, so they actually kicked her out of Persia. So she was kicked out of Persia in about AD 4. And she traveled to the borders of Judea and Syria. And here we have sort of the basic elements of the New Testament story. Because the New Testament story is a story about a royal family, because we've established they're royal already, who were in Judea in about AD 4-ish, roughly, who were in a degree of poverty, obviously. We have the typical stable story of Jesus' birth. So for some reason we have a royal family in a state of poverty who were visited by the Magi. Now, why would the Magi want to visit the birth of Jesus? Well, they would only do that if he was linked in some way with the Persian royal line, because they were the Persian priesthood, they were the Persian kingmakers. So in the story of the exile of Theomusa Urania from Persia, we have all those key elements. We have a royal family. They were exiled from Persia in about AD 4-ish. So they would have been in a state of relative poverty for a royal family, living somewhere on the borders of Judea and Syria. And if they'd had a child at that time, of course, this is the very sort of family that would have been visited by the Persian Magi, because any son of theirs would have been a potential prince of Persia. And so, of course, the Magi would have come to visit the birth. And this is, I think, exactly what happened. And this is the basis of the New Testament story.
Tell us briefly, if you will, about Palmera a little bit.
Yes, well, I think they established Palmyra. Here we have this royal family. They're exiled in a state of poverty, but they weren't poor, because when they left Persia, they obviously struck a fairly good bargain, because they left with about 200 courtiers, 600 cavalry, and half of the Persian treasury. So they were by no means poor. They had the wealth to build something anew. And they were given this strip of land between Syria and Persia on the understanding that they protected the eastern borders of Judea and Syria against the Persians. with their cavalry that they had. And just at this time, this small village called Palmyra, which was an oasis village in the middle of a desert, right in the middle between Syria and Persia, suddenly grows from a small village into a vast city that became one of the wealthiest in the Roman Empire. And you've got to ask yourself how that managed to happen. They said it happened on the back of trade, because the camel trains used to go through that area. I don't believe so. It's best explained by the arrival of Theomusa Urania, an exiled queen, a queen with influence, a queen who had half of the Persian treasury. And she was able to spend money to build whatever she wanted. So she got artisans in from across the empire, and suddenly Palmyra turned into a marvelous, big Roman, Greco-Roman city. And that, I believe, was their power base. So their power base was in Palmyra, but they had a lot of influence in Jerusalem as well, because these people went down to Jerusalem and were, quotes, converted to Judaism and spent a lot of money on the Temple of Jerusalem as well.
Right, and why don't we go into a little bit, a little bit the ending of the story, I guess, in regards to how Jesus, went or were exiled to England. Do a brief overview of that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting story, because we have this dynastic battle. We have this battle for the Roman Empire. We have Jesus making a bid for the throne of Rome. And that culminated in the siege of Jerusalem. So the Romans they invaded Judea because of the civil war going on there. They picked off all the towns and they ended up surrounding Jerusalem. Jerusalem was surrounded for about 6 months, laid siege to, and eventually was defeated and surrendered. Now, the leaders of that rebellion were all crucified. And Josephus makes a clear account of this. But as he was coming back from an expedition, he came across these 3 leaders of the rebellion being crucified. Now, one of the leaders of the rebellion was Jesus of Gamala, of course, the chap we've already talked about. So it's quite clear to me that this was a crucifixion, including Jesus of Gamala, who I've already said was the biblical Jesus. Now, pressure was put on Joseph to take these people down from the cross. And he did. He made an application to Titus, and Titus said, yes, you can take them down. So here we have a chap called Josephus taking down 3 people from crosses. And of course, that has direct links with the story about Josephus of Arimathea, who took Jesus down from the cross, of course. And Josephus, the historian, this is Saul Joseph, of course, because we're still talking about this being Saul. Saul Josephus gives these 3 medical assistants. Now, 2 of them die, 1 survives. So the story has exact parallels with the New Testament story about the crucifixion. So here we have now this defeated prince, because I say, of course, that the person who survived was Jesus of Gamala. And here we have this defeated prince crucified. What do we do with him? Well, they couldn't actually kill him, which would be the obvious thing to do, because he was too well connected, too many friends in the area. Plus, one of his primary friends was Berenice, Queen Berenice of Judea. And she happened to be now, as it were, married to Titus, who was the son of Vespasian, the emperor. It was very difficult for the emperor to knock off this chap who was the best friend of his daughter-in-law, effectively. So what else to do with him? Well, Vespasian actually had 2 things he could do with him. First of all, he wanted to take his prestige, because Vespasian was a commoner. He had no oracle on his side. And, the Romans were very religious people. And you could not have an emperor become emperor of Rome if the gods did not approve. So he needed an oracle, Why should this commoner, this tax collector, become emperor of Rome? And he used Jesus. And there is a comment in Tacitus and some of the other Roman historians that we seem to have this meeting, this trial, as it were, of Jesus before Vespasian. So he's brought to Alexandria, where Vespasian was, and we have this meeting between Jesus and Vespasian, where Jesus is made, and this guy is beaten and blooded. He can't walk, he's a cripple, and he's got dislocated arm and blind in one eye. Just the sort of wounds we might expect if someone had been hanging on the cross for 3 or 4 days. And Vespasian is made to heal this chap. He restores his sight by using exactly the same technique that Jesus had already used previously in the New Testament to restore this guy's sight. And through this process, he receives the oracle of the gods. And you have to ask yourself why. You know, why does healing this pauper who's brought before him, who happens to be blind, why does that give royal assent, as it were, to Vespasian? Well, it's quite obvious to me that this was a meeting with Jesus, and so Jesus the royal is now being healed by Vespasian. And if Vespasian can heal this royal person, then surely Vespasian is greater than this person. He must have the oracle of the gods. And I think this is what was happening. So Vespasian was looking for a good omen, a good oracle, and he was using this beaten and blooded rebel, this Jesus, King Jesus of Judea, to take, as it were, his royal aura and use that to become emperor of Rome. And immediately he sailed for Rome and formally accepted the emperorship. Now, what do you do with this husk of a beaten man? You know, he's a cripple, he's dislocated shoulder, still blind in one eye probably. What do you do with him? Couldn't kill him, he was too well connected. So I believe he was sent into exile. And the only thing you can do with a rebel of this nature is send him as far away as you possibly can from his position of power. So his power base was Judea and Syria, and so as far away as you possibly can within the Roman Empire was England, which was recently invaded, of course, by the Romans in the early decades AD.
Right, and tell us a little bit about the Vesica Pius's palace in Chester.
Yes, well, we have this strange, I think, of course, that he was taken to Deva. Now, Deva is Chester. It's the Roman fortress they built in Chester. And it's in a strange location. It's miles from anywhere. It's beyond all the marshes of Cheshire, out on the River Dee, close to the sea, but not dominating any hinterland. So it's almost totally remote from the Roman Empire, and nobody knows why they built it in that particular position, because it doesn't seem logical militarily. And what I'm saying, of course, is that it was built there to house political prisoners. So it was a Spandau prison of the 1st century AD, and that's why it is so remote. Now, within this particular strange fortress Deva in Chester, we have some unknown buildings. Now, they're completely unique in the Roman Empire. Now, this fortress also was the biggest fortress in the Roman Empire, and it was big because it had these extra buildings put in the middle of it. And one of these extra buildings was this elliptical building, which was a complete enclosed community within the fortress. So it had its own accommodation block, it had its own temple, it had its own bathhouse. Now, who in the Roman Empire would be totally separatist from the rest of the Romans? This quite obviously, to me, wasn't Romans living in this area, because they would use the other bathhouse. Now, the primary peoples who were always separatist within the Roman Empire were the Jews, because they would not eat with Romans, they would not bathe with Romans, they would not pray with Romans. And that was always a problem within the empire, because you had this separatist group of people who were not indulging in the Roman Empire. It's a bit like we have with Islam within the 21st century in Europe. We have this group of people who will not mix with the rest of the population and regard the rest of the population with a degree of disdain. Now, so this separatist faction within this fortress is likely to be Judaic. And that's probably confirmed because this particular building is not elliptical as such, although it's called that. It is actually Vesica Piscis. So it's formed from two interlocking hemispheres of a circle. And this symbolism, of course, is the symbolism of Pisces, of the constellation of Pisces. So in effect, what we have here is a temple dedicated to Pisces. Now, who in this era, 1st century AD, would be making a temple dedicated to Pisces? And it's not only dedicated to Pisces, but it's actually divided up into 12 rooms. So it's actually dedicated to the whole of the zodiac. So it really is, it's a temple of the zodiac and a temple of Pisces in the middle of a Roman fortress. Well, the only people who are really into the zodiac, and especially into Pisces, were the fourth sect of Jesus and James. That's why Jesus became the fisher of men. That's why the symbol of Christianity is the fish, because they were following the rise of Pisces, because Pisces had just become the dominant constellation in the 1st century AD. And so here in Fortress D, where we suddenly have this temple dedicated to Pisces, and it has to be something to do with this same fourth sect. And of course, the leader of that fourth sect was Jesus of Gamala, and we just have been through the history of Jesus of Gamala, where he must have been exiled somewhere. And that's why I say he was exiled into Fortress Deva.
Right, and this connects obviously with King Arthur, as you've been, leading into this. This is a new book.
Yes.
This is about this. I'd like to pop one question though before that, and that is, because many people are looking at the astrological, aspect to all this. They recognize, they see zodiacs everywhere, and speaking about Jesus, one tends to think that this is only about the sun god Jesus, the mythological character Jesus. But you're talking about Jesus of Gamala here, a real person.
A real person.
So what is going on here? Is there a difference here?
No, not really. It's the same story. It just depends how you interpret it. Now, I interpret it as Jesus as being a prince in exile, an Egyptian prince. Now, all of the Egyptian princes were the sons of God, just as Jesus was, of course. And the primary god they were sons of was Ra, of course. They were either the son of the moon god, Tuthmosis means the son of the moon god, Ahmosis means the son of the moon god, or they were the son of Ra, so Ramesses means the son of the sun god. So all of the pharaohs of Egypt, and Jesus following in that tradition, would have been a son of the sun god. And so of course he would have been identified with the sun god, because he was the sun god's representative on earth, and so here we have the reason why he has this association with the sun god. But that doesn't mean, of course, that he was a mythological person. Just because there is a myth and a religion surrounding his position doesn't mean that he was mythological. So I believe he was a real person, he was a real prince, he was a pharaoh of Egypt, obviously in exile twice in a way, because they'd already been to Persia, back now into Judea. And here was this royal family that was intimately connected with all of the empires of the East. So here was a prince who was a prince of Rome through Julius Caesar. He was a prince of Egypt through Cleopatra. He was a prince of Persia through Phraates IV. And he was a prince of North Africa, indeed, by Juba II. So here was a prince who was heir to the whole of the known world. And that's why he had the power and the influence to make a bid for the throne of Rome.
Let's see here. The big connection, I guess, that arises here is we've been talking about the Pisces symbolism.
Yes.
of the fish.
Yes.
And if we think of the king and the fish and put it together, we get the Fisher King.
We get the Fisher King.
Is that the big connection to King Arthur here, or is this something else?
That is one of the big connections with King Arthur, because within Parsifal, of course, we have the Fisher King. But as you read about the Fisher King, he seems to be confused entirely with King Arthur. And it seems quite obvious to me he's a sort of an incarnation of King Arthur, because the Fisher King is the Grail King. He's the holder. He lives in the Grail Castle, and he's the holder of the Grail. Now, who's going to be the holder of the Grail if it's not King Arthur himself? And of course, the Fisher King has to be an allusion, of course, to Pisces again. And who was the Fisher King in the 1st century AD? Well, it has to be Jesus of Gamala, who was the leader of 600 rebel fishermen. This fish symbolism goes all the way through it, of course. And it comes back to Pisces and astrology. So the Fisher King, undoubtedly to me, was an incarnation of Jesus. And viewers might say, oh no, this happened in the Dark Ages, 6th century AD. But not quite so, because if you read the Vulgate cycle and if you read indeed Parsifal, there's a lot of confusion between the era in which this is set. So sometimes they're talking Dark Ages, sometimes they're talking battles with the Saxons, sometimes they're talking battles with the Romans, and sometimes they're talking about meeting Josephus of Arimathea. So of course, you know, once you start involving Joseph of Arimathea in this story, then obviously we're taking it right back into the 1st century AD. And I think that is what's happened. The original story was a story about the 1st century AD. It was a story about this king, King Jesus, the Fisher King, who was exiled to Chester. So now we have a King Jesus, a King Fisher King in England. And we have all this mythology about his battles with the Romans, because he did do battles with the Romans, but not in England, of course, in Judea. And people writing about this king and his exploits, you know. But that was heretical. That could result in you being stretched on the rack or burnt at the stake, because what you were saying effectively is that Jesus did not die on the cross. Because if he died on the cross, he couldn't be sitting there in England. So what do you do? Well, if you still want to perpetuate this story, you have to put a different story against it. And I think what they did is they slightly changed the story for their own protection, and they made Jesus into a mythological English warrior king called Arthur, and he was called Arthur because that is the original name for Egypt. Jesus in England would have been known as the Egyptian king, because he was an Egyptian prince. And of course, one of the names for Egypt was Arturi. And so he would have been known as King Arthur, king of the Egyptians. And so they made up this story about this wonderful king of England now, who was living, well, we can't have him in the 1st century. That's a little bit too dangerous. So, okay, we'll make it 6th century. That's much safer. I won't get burnt then. And so we end up with this mythological story about King Arthur and his great deeds in England.
Fascinating. And of course, one thing that comes to mind here is that you're speaking of Jesus as the castrated king, that he was,
yes.
you know, he
yes.
was, this could be, you know, either of the circumcision, that this is a symbolic, you know, thing regarding that, but how does kids and, you know, castration go together in that sense?
Well, I think Vespasian had another problem. He's sending a dangerous rebel into exile here. He wants to keep him as far away from the Roman Empire as he possibly can, which he does by sticking him in Fortress Deva, which was a Spandau prison of the 1st century AD. But the last thing you want is this rebel prisoner suddenly spawning tens of kids in exile in England, which is quite possible, of course. So the only logical thing you can do is to castrate the chap. And I think it wasn't just a reference to circumcision, it was a reference to real castration. And that is why he became known as the maimed king. So again, if you go back into Parsifal, the Fisher King is also known as the maimed king. And specifically, he is maimed in the genitals, and that makes him powerless. And that just has to be a reference to castration.
But he did have kids, didn't he not? Jesus,
oh, he would have done before he was exiled.
Right.
Yeah. He had at least 4 children before. He might have even had more, but he had at least 4 children before he was exiled. So we do have strands of this family spreading out across the empire. And of course, within Judaism and within Egyptian history, the family line runs through the female, not the male. So the fate of Jesus is largely irrelevant. It's the fate of Mary Magdalene, his wife, that is much more pertinent. So she could still have children, of course, even after these events. Well, presumably, how old would she have been? I think she would still been just about old enough. I'll have to think back as to when. I think she was born in about AD 20s. So by AD 70s, no, she would have been too old. But anyway, it's the fate of the female line that would have been much more pertinent here. And we know that they had children. They would have had subsequent children before this era as well. So they would have spread out across the Mediterranean. And there could be any number of those left, any number.
You talk about Jesus also as the tax collector. A lot of
Yes.
revolving this is about taxes, and one thing that comes to mind is of course about money in general in regards to the Bible. One is encouraged not to have a lot of money.
Not
Jesus.
so.
Okay. Tell us about it.
Not so. If you go through some of his parables,
Right.
some of his parables are quite peculiar in some respects, considering what we've been told about Jesus. One of his parables is the parable of the absentee landlord. Now, the absentee landlord owns a farm. He has a farmer, and he wants payment from this land from this farmer. So he sends someone to the farmer and says, "Look, I want my money," and the farmer kills him. And so he sends another servant, says, "Look, I want my money," and he kills him as well. And finally, the absentee landlord sends his son and says, "We want our money," and the farmer kills him as well. And Jesus finally ends up saying, "Well, should not the farmer be killed then?" So this is a parable about the rights of absentee landlords to demand taxes from the people under them. There are quite a few of these parables within the Bible which run against our general perception. We also have the parable about the servants that were given money. One was given money and he invested it and doubled it, and Jesus said, "Marvelous, that's great." And another servant went out and he invested some of it and he made a little bit of money, and he said, "Well, yeah, okay, you haven't done very well, but never mind." And another servant went out and he buried the money, and then when his master came back, he dug up the money and gave it back and said, "Look, here's your money." And he said, "You slothful servant, why didn't you invest the money and get more money for me?" And again, he prepared the way for killing this guy. Which is basically saying, look, you've got to invest money. Capitalism is great. That's what he's saying. That's the message. So it's not quite as we've really been told. Some of these messages, some of these parables are very firmly pro the rights of landlords and the investment of money, capitalism, basically. So that was the Jesus we're talking about.
Fascinating. I want to ask you a little bit about the things that we can see in our world today. Let's begin with this one. Cleopatra's Needle can be found in London,
Yes.
Paris, and New York, I think. There are 3 different ones.
Yes, 3 different ones.
What does that mean to you?
Well, there was a great interest in the Victorian era in everything Egyptian. A strand of Egyptian theology, I believe, has come up to us via Masonry. So this was an underground, this church was destroyed. The victor in this battle was not Jesus, his church was destroyed. So the 4th sect, the Galilean sect, the Gnostic sect, who were, they were looking for knowledge. That was the basis of Gnosticism. They were looking for knowledge. And if you can sum up Gnosticism in one word in English, we today would call it science. So it was a religion of science about investigation, new techniques, the solar system, astronomy, mathematics. Now, that was largely destroyed, and of course the victor in this battle was the Catholic Church, which was the Church of Saul. And of course the Church of Saul had nothing to do with the Church of Jesus. So modern Christianity that we know has nothing to do whatsoever with the Church of Jesus. He was the victor, and Jesus' church, especially after the Council of Nicaea, just went underground, basically. And we have these Gnostic underground roots which finally emerged within Masonry. And so we have elements of, I'm not saying it's identical to by any means, but we have elements of original Church of Jesus Gnosticism within Masonry. And these elements, of course, became more dominant after the Protestant revolutions and so on, after the Renaissance, after the Enlightenment era, and have come more to the fore, which is why we now have science. And this is why this discussion is actually quite relevant and quite important to the modern era. We stagnated for the whole of the Dark Ages, most of the Middle Ages, we stagnated. Science only became science when Gnosticism came back to the fore and you were no longer afraid of being burnt at the stake for suggesting bizarre things like the sun being at the center of the solar system. The resurgence of science only came to the fore after the Renaissance, after the Enlightenment era. And suddenly, when you were no longer fearful of being burnt at the stake for suggesting bizarre things like the sun being the center of the solar system, suddenly we had this outpouring of science and investigation. Suddenly we had the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly we had the emergence of Masonry in 1717 with the emergence of Grand Lodge, United Grand Lodge. And I think there's no coincidence to that. The whole of this battle, the battle from Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth I, all the way through to King William, was a battle of darkness against light. And so that's why it's known as the Enlightenment era. And that ensured that we finally put a lid on the power of the Catholic Church, the Church of Saul, St Paul. And at last we had the resurgence of the Church of Jesus, because as I said before, we have these elements of the Church of Jesus within Masonry. So at last we had the position where people could come out and actually indulge in science, which the Church would have thought as heretical. So this is why this story is vitally important, that we need to perpetuate the Enlightenment, because it's only through the Enlightenment we have science, and it's only through science we have the Industrial Revolution. It's only through the Industrial Revolution that we have the wealth that we have and the freedoms that we have today. For saying what I'm saying now, I would have been burnt at the stake, no doubt, during the hegemony of the Catholic era. And so we have to protect those freedoms. You know, we fought for those freedoms for about 300 years, between Henry VIII and all the way through to, no, it's 200 years, isn't it? From Henry VIII all the way through to William of Orange, who came, of course, from Holland, who was another Protestant king, became King of England, King of Britain pretty well. And we are threatened by darkness once more. You know, the dogmatic cult of Islam is descending upon Europe. And this is a cult that wants to take us back to the Dark Ages, where the whole of mankind's knowledge is wrapped up in one book that was written by an illiterate Bedouin in 620 AD. Now, these were the very aspects that we were fighting against during the Enlightenment era. And we can't go back to that sort of era, that sort of time, which is why we have to stand up for our rights and propagate this Gnosticism, the original Church of Jesus, not the Church of the Catholic Church, but the original Church of Jesus, which has elements, as I say, within Masonry, that allow for freedoms, that allow for science, that allow for research, that look towards the future, not look continually towards the past, which most of Islam does, of course. So it has a message for the future. It's not just history of the past. Without a history of the past, we can't see in which direction we're actually going in now. And if we're not careful, we might start going backwards. So we've got to still maintain our trajectory, maintain the openness of our society, maintain the openness of research, whether it happens to be astrology, mathematics, technology, whatever it happens to be.
I mean, some people say that we actually are moving in that direction, because if we consider, the threat of terrorism and all this, the Western civilization is engaging in threats against its own population in a way, yes. And control is, rampant in that sense, surveillance, it's a paranoia spreading. Yeah. Are we losing that freedom?
I think we are definitely losing those freedoms. We are being ruled again by religious fanatics, which is what we fought for over 200 years against. In those eras, the religious fanatics were the Catholics, who had their own self-serving institution called the Catholic Church, who was basically only there to serve its own purposes. It was peddling lies, but they didn't care about that because it maintained their position. It maintained their positions of power, and they had a complete power over Europe and much of the rest of the world. It was the most powerful institution in Europe. And of course they were going to perpetuate that, but to the detriment of everybody else, because they would not allow any research into new areas of thought, because new areas of thought were dangerous, because you might get chaps like myself pulling apart the foundations of the Catholic Church. So they couldn't have that, so they banned it all. But now, of course, we have this threat from the East, which is identical to the old threats from the Catholic Church. A fundamentalist religion that's based on the principles of knowledge, all stemming from one book. So it's anti-technology, it's anti-freedom, it's anti-research, it's anti-gnosis, basically. And if we allow them to dominate our society, to dominate our politics, then we will go backwards. I'm pretty sure of that.
We have about 1 minute left here on the tape, but overall, are you positive or pessimistic for the future?
I'm pessimistic for the next 5 years. I think we will prevail. I think common sense will prevail, and Europe will turn again towards an open form of debate, and reassert the dominance of the secular society within Europe. I'm hoping we will, but I don't see it within the next few years because I see no politicians pointing in that direction. But we have to reassert the dominance of the secular society and to push these religious fanatics back into the shadows from whence they came. And the only way we can do that is through research, speaking openly about it, and ridicule if necessary. That is the way we've always championed over fanatical religions.
We get encourage research, we get encourage openness. So what do you think? Are we heading in that direction eventually then, after this 5 years you mentioned of dark dark
yes period? For the immediate future, I'm pessimistic. We're not heading in the right direction. We have no leaders with authority to take us in the right direction. Nobody speaking out against the darkness of a totalitarian religion. Nobody speaking up for the Enlightenment. Nobody speaking up for the secular society. And if we're not careful, we'll be subsumed again by this religious fanaticism. And we have to fight against it. But in the end, I'm confident that eventually a leader will emerge and will fight for the Enlightenment once more. So we need a new Henry VIII. We need a new Elizabeth I, or even a William of Orange from Holland, of course, who fought for the Enlightenment, fought for openness, and fought for the secular society, because it is that secular society that has brought us our wealth. And if we go back to a dominant religion, especially a dark religion that simply looks backwards and believes all human knowledge stems from one book written in the 6th century AD, then we will lose our civilization, we will lose Europe, we will lose our technical edge within science and technology, and we will lose our economy that maintains our lifestyles within Europe that we are so complacent with at present. We fought for those rights and for that comfort, for that economic wealth. Our ancestors put in great efforts to fight for those freedoms. And if we don't do it again, we shall lose it, basically.
And do you think it's up to the individual, or are you looking for a leader to lead us in this?
Yeah. You tend to need a leader, but you need individuals to back up the leader. A leader is not a leader if they don't have followers. So whoever emerges as the leader needs followers to back up the leader and his crusade against this darkness of Islam that's spreading across Europe. And I see it in those terms. It's darkness and lightness. That's why the Enlightenment, as I said before, was called the Enlightenment era, because they identified themselves with the light, the illumination, the knowledge from Gnosticism. And that's the area we've got to go into. I'm hoping that such a movement will come to the fore in Europe. And it may be a pan-European event, because we have a pan-European society now, of course, within the EU, and we have these very similar problems across Europe, whether it's up in your lands in Scandinavia, whether it's down through Holland all the way down through to Spain. We have very similar problems within Europe, so this may be a pan-European movement that actually evolves to rid us of this threat from Islam.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.